So I think what I wanted to speak to, because me and Jenny have spoken about what she had shared at a previous workshop, so around more the mechanics and physiology of birth itself, and I wanted to build on that and think about the spaces of birth in terms of how it affects clinicians' behaviour. I don't know how well I've achieved that because it's so intertwined to how it affects women and birthing people's labour. So we'll see. Anyway, I'll give you an insight. I've been dreadful with references, but I can back this all up with references. Sarah's in there though, because Sarah wrote an article when I was the editor. So Sarah, I've quoted you relatively correctly. I've put the citation up. So yeah, let's move on. Oh, it's not working. I have to click this specifically, do I?
Oh. Put it on full screen and then it would...
I don't know, I didn't touch it, so it was set up for me. Does it have to be like that?
I think it's because I've uploaded the slides to Teams.
Because it's on presenter mode.
So that it's also in the recording.
I wonder if you close the notes.
I mean, I don't need them.
You can't write
Yeah, I don't know.
the slides.
Yeah, I mean, I don't need everyone to see all of that there. But I think it's probably because I'm presenting it to Sarah.
I think you could, if you swapped it over, I don't mind you not presenting it to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing in the notes. Yeah. There we go. So this was from Sarah's fab piece that she did for us as the practicing midwife. But, you know, we know birth environment influences birth physiology and psychology, and there's lots of evidence to demonstrate that. And it is influenced by the environment, which takes the space is either a driving force or can put a brake on the actual process. And so that depends on how the necessary physiological conditions of privacy and safety are provided and enabled. Now, what you did with your birth is an amazing way to mitigate against that classic clinical harsh environment. And it can be done. But it can be harder, and I'll tell you more about why it can be harder, particularly, and I am going to focus on hospital because that's where most women give birth, whichever way they give birth, but most choose to go there, even if they weren't planning or expecting an instrument or caesarean section. So when we're thinking about the physical space, we're thinking about the room, including the size, the heating, the lighting, equipment or not in the room, and we'll talk a bit more about equipment and how visually that changes people's behaviour. And you've put it up there already, the sight, sound, smells. Smells is something that we forget about all the time. Imagine going to the hospital, what does that smell evoke? You know, it's clinical, it's sterile, it's sick people, you know, etc. The other thing with sound, you've got obviously you can hear other things, and I'm not just talking about other women screaming in labour, but you know, just the hospital sounds, the buzzers, the door buzzer. Drives me nuts. Even though I know it's a good security thing, you know, don't people walking out with babies, but my brain can't cope. And interruptions or not, and we'll talk more about that. What happens in a classic hospital delivery suite labour ward environment, which all negatively influence experiences and objective measures of birth. So, and all of this, when we're thinking about that birth environment, is the wider context of that birth venue, is that hospital, birth centre, and I'd love us just to touch on the difference and why it's really important to understand the objective measured difference between a co-located birth centre and a freestanding birth centre, because they're hugely different in terms of their outcomes. And then of course that wider context of the birth venue and the relationship the woman has to it, because if the woman feels safe in the hospital, then that's a good thing. And she's in the hospital, she's where she wants to be, that's obviously a protective factor against some of those things that can make hospital a challenging space to give birth. And of course the relationships between women and the caregivers. Is the birth venue, is the space providing, enabling the midwife to solely focus on that woman in labour? Or is she being called to other things? Has she got 3 people in labour? Now that was stopped, but that's probably come back in terms of staffing, and I think some units are not doing what we call one-to-one care in labour. It was a massive thing when I was a student, that midwives and units, not where I was trained at, we're expected to look after 3 women in labour. So you might have one pushing, early stage of pushing, another one just come in, etc. And the safety issues around that are enormous. And that was a massive drive back then, 2008 to 11. So it was 1-to-1, one midwife. But is she really with you? Is she enabled to be and hold the space in the way that you need her to hold the space, whatever that looks like to you, whether that's facilitating the epidural or otherwise? Or is she subject to other demands, interruptions? And obviously everything we're talking about here is so hard to extract that impact on the family in there and the caregivers. The difference being is that clinicians are going to feel comfortable in this space. I hate hospitals personally, but I'm really comfortable in them now because I've spent so much time in them as, you know, caring for people. So, you know, you do start walking around like you own the place because, you know where everything is, you know, all this, that and the other. So it's a very different experience. So just to touch on this, so you probably know about, you know, Foucault's thorough critique around the panopticon, and I'm putting the hospital medical gaze. As me and Ben were talking about earlier, perhaps, and we were saying that maybe new birth centres are still kind of got this modern hospital architecture, although they're pretty aesthetically pleasing, and most of them are really good with having birthing pools planted. I don't think we've jumped in enough away. I think the old cottage hospitals have that more family feel to them. So, you know, you've got the central surveillance nurses station, and for us, midwife station, so we can see everyone, we know everything that's going on, you know, and I'm sure you can visualise that Foucault's, you know, that image on that book. So we've got those medical, and you know, when you, for anyone who has been as nerdy as I have to look at the history of how guidelines and standardisation and things like that actually came into being, and how we've got to this situation now where government's procedures and pieces of paper supersede individualised care, we start to look at, when you look at the history, the rise of the hospital enterprise, it wasn't this beautiful altruistic enterprise. There were some altruistic components of it, but actually it was a power grab, and hospitals became this incredible, perfect place. The doctors didn't have to go to people anymore, bring the people to them. So they became in charge, and you know, what we've got historically around these hierarchical structures, even though you've got amazing doctors like Philippa now who are challenging those hierarchies, we have inherited this inherently power dynamic structured space. And we strip people of their identity, and and they become disembodied, and that was the nature and the rise of this hospital. And, you know, I'll put it in bold there, the clinic was part of the socio-economic interests of those with power, and we really have to remember that when we're thinking about spaces. And so, yeah, a patient can be manipulated by the professional authority of the medical gaze. And no more than maternity, I can tell you. So it's the most common birthing venue. It came in, rolled in the UK in the 70s, for those of you who don't know, from the famous Peel reports that condemned home birthing, condemned, it was really associated with impoverished women, and it was dirty and this, that and the other. Never mind the fact that doctors accidentally were killing patients because they were going from the mortuary to live women in labour and infecting them. So, but it is the most common, but I just have to be really strong here. There was no evidence that hospitals were safer. There still is no evidence that hospitals are safer. So, I'm really mindful of time. So this isn't the worst picture of the world, because at least got one midwife support and the partner is focusing on the woman. You know, this, and it's obviously staged. This is from Shutterstock, this, that, and the other. But we'll talk through, this is a classic birthing room in a hospital. We'll talk through like some of the issues that come up in this. So, you know, depersonalised individuals, thinking about Foucault's thing around, you know, stripping your identity, disembodying people, particularly from that Descartes influence, mind-body split, you know, your values and who you are and your preferences, leave them at the door because this is my, you know, territory, you're going to do as I say. Gowns are a symbol of that, and there's a lot of sociological critique around that. And what does that say for the you know, the clinician, and the point of me talking today? how that changes. I'd be there in uniform, or maybe my own clothes if I've been called in from community, but generally uniform or scrubs. You've got that power differential instantly, particularly some with a gown and it's exposed. The gowns, why they haven't changed the design, you know, people don't want their bottom showing, but yet we have to double wrap them and all sorts, right? So that's straight away, and just getting into the gown, you know, that's quite a patronising, dearie, come here dearie, come on, you know, pop your pyjamas on, you know, type thing. So, you know, it's straight away you're starting to change someone's behaviour and psychology. Women and their partners and birthing people, they're strangers to the environment. So, you know, like I say, I don't like hospitals, but I'm at home there now, right? People, you instantly, they're the guest. Particularly for birth partners, and particularly, I would say, stereotypically, male birth partners coming very nervy. They want to be in hospital, they feel safer in hospital, they want the gadgets that go ping. And yet once they're in hospital, they are incredibly scared, which is completely normal and natural. But their power dynamics, and sometimes they can coerce their partners alongside with what the doctor or midwife says, because that power dynamics, well, you just listen to the doctor, etc. Not all, obviously. Everything I say, it's obviously not all, but just get into the nub of some of those issues. So you're inviting people, you're allowing them in, you have possibly only allowed entrance if they've done a vaginal examination, a highly intimate, invasive procedure, and now you're allowed in through the doors. And then this is a really controlled birthplace. I mean, look at all that equipment, and that's a really classic room. But who's going to control it? Midwives, we very often, or maternity care assistants, we keep the rooms tidy, neat, to put everything away, because God forbid there's an emergency, you need to be able to run. You can't move anything in an emergency. No, you need a straight, clear thing. Always told off about that as a student. So all of this, and in terms of birth psychology, you've got the power dynamics here, but you've also got the birth psychology. And Michelle and Don found that if he went into a room that was too neat and he just messed it up and shifted things around, women actually got into that more primal space. So, and it's us controlling that birth room. Bed, central focal point, is a massive, 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 massive issue. What message does that instill? We associate the hospital bed with being a patient, with being ill and poorly. It creates that, and you've got nearly always in the middle of the room. And it's so ingrained that even when we used to do QI projects, to move, just move the bed. Just move to it, honestly, nothing radical, just move it to the side of the room. You come in the next day and it'd all been moved back. It was just too much for people to cope with, that the bed shouldn't be the focal point of the room. Sorry?
What's QI?
Sorry, quality improvement that Polly was talking about. So we do these little projects, try and make things better, get midwives thinking about how to help people off the bed. So, you know, this isn't a purely, you know, bad picture, because she is off the bed, she's in the birth pool. But beds become this focal point. So always need to talk, I mean the clock, you know, it's visible there, clock and clock time versus labour times. You know, you've got the metaphorical tick-tock, 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 you've got the sound tick-tock, tick-tock, so they are ticky clocks, right? And they absolutely represent everything that is the problem, the tension between a labour, whether it's spontaneous or even induced and someone is now contracting, and bureaucratic systems. You know, we're trying to control labour, we want them to operate to time, and we've created all of these procedures and interventions and the partogram and everything that says a labour should work linearly, and it doesn't work in a linear fashion. Equally, and this is the problem with birthing within a big scale institution, obviously the footfall that goes through a hospital is enormous. So in empathy to the scale of healthcare, their routines are required to a degree, but that doesn't fit with the maternity model, it doesn't fit with labour. And it absolutely lends itself to procedure-orientated care, not individualised care. More intervention, definitely, and this medical gaze. And you really, you know, you've even got research of midwives fudging things. You know, doing good by stealth was the term in the 90s, because they knew as soon as they said the woman was 10 centimetres, the clock was like tick, 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 tick. So all these women had anterior lips, which is a tiny little bit of cervix out, you know, so that meant that clock, that big clock didn't start ticking before forceps or something. The centrality of equipment and the CTG, which is continuous monitor, what happens is when you've got things in the room that don't need to be there, there's enough evidence to show that clinicians are more likely to use it if it's just a hand, and so it becomes a reassurance, it becomes a comfy blanket thing. The problem with something like the CCG, which is that fetal monitor, is that 50 years of using it and a whole huge body of evidence hasn't demonstrated benefits for the baby, but it has increased the C-section rate. But yet it's still custom and practice. It's still such a focal point in a hospital room and is overused too much. And then what happens there, it changes the clinician's behaviour because you're watching the CTG. You're not watching the woman anymore. You're not observing, you're not with her. Not everyone every time, but you know what I'm saying here. This happens too often because we've got the evidence to show it. The other issue on the labour ward is the interruptions. So you've got this, especially Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, you've got audits, you've got infection control, you've got the elective list for caesarean sections, you've got busyness, more people. The work is so much better at night, although night shifts don't like me. You've got that ebb and flow, you've got the routines, and you've also got people in and out of the room. Some places do better on this than others, but there's always equipment missing somewhere. There is always, I can't find a thermometer, just come in. And so your good colleagues will at least knock and wait for you to come to the door, so you're keeping that space nice and held. Not so great colleagues will knock and walk straight in, and the worst ones will just walk straight in. So in terms of that dignity and that space and privacy, that's why something like that is just absolutely brilliant, because even if you've got someone really inconsiderate, that's there protecting them. I worked somewhere where they didn't shut the doors on the labour ward. Didn't shut them. They used the curtain, didn't shut them. So you've got all these women bellowing down the hallway, and the band 7, which is the senior midwife, would just come in every now and again and look at someone's perineum and go, well done, and then walk out again. And I was the crazy student that used to shut all the doors. I went up and down the corridor shutting the doors. So it's so you can't separate cultural custom and practice and the environment. It's also put those midwives at home. It would be a very different story, because they are going to be so out of their comfort zone. They are going to be asking permission, etc. But yeah, barging in is a big, big problem. Lighting, this is very typical, harsh, fluorescent lighting. Do we need it in the birth room? Can we make it cosy? Can we make it nice? Obviously, you will know about this in terms of birth physiology, but what about clinician physiology? Do you want a very highly stressed person, like when I'm being pulled to 3 different places at once and 10 people have come in asking for a thermometer? No, I do not have one! And I've got bright lights, and then my stress levels are up here at cortisol levels. Or can I help me and everyone else in the room and turn those lights down, put some pretty lights on? As Polly said, these are often seen as nice to haves, but actually they make such a massive difference on our physiology and psychology. And as I've said here, it impacts on the birth physiology, and it influences the caregivers' approaches and practices. We know that clinicians, midwives particular, because they tend to be the ones that might go to a home birth centre or hospital, they do behave, we've got studies to show that even the most home birthy midwife, send her into hospital, she will start to adopt the custom and practice of where she is and adopt a more technocratic approach, such as the power of that. But equally it can be undone as well, so that's the thing, it's not all doom and gloom. But the main issue in my mind, or one of the big issues about the space, institutional birth spaces, is how it influences practitioners through these invisible structures. And Polly you started to talk about, we tend to focus on, and I'm guilty of at the time, the hierarchy we say between MCAs, midwives, doctors, but actually it's the invisible things. There's bureaucracy, health and safety going mad, not letting a birth ball get plugged in, or infection control saying you can't use birth balls. That happens in some places, it's completely bizarre. So it's these things that really influence the institutional running. doing things to time, to a routine, absolutely is counter to the ebb and flow of labour. So then you have routine-based care, procedure-based care, bureaucracy, vagina examination because it's 4 hours. It's a nonsense. It's not even based on anything other than this clock time. And then guideline-centred care, which is my whole entire PhD, so I won't talk about that. Fear and defensive practice is a massive problem, and risk and litigation. These are all things, and Philippa alluded to that earlier, it's much easier to defend what you have done as opposed to what you haven't done. Now, all of these things home birth, midwife, birth centres, they're all coming under a institution unless they're fully independent and self-employed. They do influence those birth spaces, but not to the same degree as hospitals. They're so heightened within those hierarchical structures of hospitals, and we know that from the evidence of outcomes, from physiological birth to women's subjective experiences, etc. So very much reinforce the space room, the panopticon reinforces the surveillance. My job isn't to care and develop a relationship with you, it's to survey you. And are you meeting certain criteria? And if not, let's do something. And it's very disembodied and depersonalised. So, contrast this with home birthing. You've got, the woman, she's in her own space. There was a lovely one here who was talking about families earlier. The midwife is coming in, she's the guest in the home. Power dynamics inverted immediately. Yes, there's likely to be interruptions. I've certainly had gas men turn up, point this, that, the other, whatever else. Yes, the interruptions, but very ordinary, everyday interruptions. You become such a guard of that front door. It's like, no, go away. And I won't go on too much about it because I know I'm way over time, but and it's not to valorise home birthing, it's to demonstrate the difference between us being, bringing women in and them being the guest, and how can they make that space their own, to then midwives actually having that power dynamic being inverted. And some doctors have gone to home births, and some lovely articles, and who very much, there's a really brilliant article, Florence Wilcox went to a home birth, and that's exactly what she noticed. I'm the guest, that's what she kept saying, I'm the guest. And actually we just did a lot of sitting. We didn't do a lot of doing. We were watching and waiting, and all of those subtle, tacit, actually high-level expertise skills are coming into play as opposed to this doing and following the rule book or guideline book. And then this, I love this because I use this with students to say, well, this is completely reimagining a birth space, and this comes from these people here. And yeah, I put that up on my collage to think, and that's so womb-like, isn't it? How would you feel in that space? Because like I say, don't get me wrong, I love birth centres, I've worked in all spaces. Home is my favourite for those reasons I said earlier. It's just a very ordinary part of someone's day. But I mean, something like this, how absolutely incredible. And yes, and I want to point out positive examples do exist in hospitals, but what I don't understand is why this isn't consistent. Some of the basic aesthetics could be done tomorrow, everywhere. And my lovely colleague in Wales, that's what, just that tiny change. You've got this centrality of the bed, this, that, and the other. It's equipment, it's ugly, it's horrible. I don't think
Is that the same room?
Same room, yeah. And there's another picture, sorry, I don't think I'll put it up, where the bed's pushed to that side, some of that equipment is taken away, etc. I don't know if I put the other ones up there. No, I didn't, because I'm so over time, I'm so sorry.
That was fantastic, thank you.